People who knew celebrities before they made it big. What were they like? I have friends who knew Pedro Pascal when he was a struggling actor in New York City. He used to come into the coffee shop my friends worked at and chat with them about auditions and plays he was in. He even comped them tickets to a few of his performances. For a while, he used to comment on their Instagram photos of their kids and wish them happy birthday and whatnot. He still might, but I'm not on Instagram anymore to see it. Obviously, they thought he was a great guy. And for him to stay in touch with a couple of baristas years after he knew them seems to prove he is.
That's a pretty cool story. It's nice to hear how someone like Pedro Pascal was down to earth back then. I mean, staying in touch with friends from when he was struggling definitely shows some character. It's interesting how these connections can last even after someone becomes famous. Makes you realize that some folks remember where they came from and appreciate the people who supported them.
My parents both knew Ryan Gosling when he was going to the high school they worked at. They always talk about how nice and polite he was. My mom worked with special needs kids, and she still talks about how Ryan, who was already a bit of a celeb, would always take time to talk to them and sit and chat, and was just great with them. The drama teacher at the school at that time is my dad's friend, and he always claims he taught Ryan everything he knows.
That's interesting. It's cool to hear stories about celebrities before they were famous. Sounds like Ryan was a nice guy, especially with the special needs kids. It's always nice when someone in the spotlight remembers to stay grounded. Your dad's friend must feel proud claiming to have taught him. Those connections can give a glimpse of how someone becomes who they are.
I went to the same high school as Josh Hutcherson, and one of my good friends lived in the same neighborhood. He wasn't around too often because he was already in some movies, but he was just a quiet kid who at the time I thought was stuck up. But now I realize it was probably difficult for him to juggle the normal high school life and a budding Hollywood career. Future Man is one of my favorite shows, and I wish I could tell him that LOL.
That's an interesting story. It's always weird to think about how people balance normal life and fame. Your friend must have had a lot on his plate back then. It's cool you enjoy Future Man. It shows you can appreciate his work even if he seemed distant in school. Life has a way of changing perspectives.
I worked with J.K. Simmons and Sandra Oh before they were famous. Both worked regularly, though. I don't have a bad thing to say about either of them. I have periodically seen Sandra since then, and can say that she is still a wonderful person. I haven't run into J.K., but from what I hear, he's still awesome too.
That's cool to have worked with them before they hit it big. Sounds like you have some good memories. It must be nice to see Sandra later and find she's still the same person. It's rare when people stay genuine after fame. JK seems pretty down to earth too, so I'm not surprised to hear he's still awesome. Good vibes all around.
Jon Bernthal. When we were kids, he was best friends of one of my cousins. I used to be at that house all the time, and eventually my aunt and uncle took me in. Jon was typical boy, super wild but a nice kid. Used to absolutely wreck my pillow forts, fart on the pillows and laugh like a maniac. LOL. He was always really smart though, and a good person. I bumped into him years ago when we were in our 30s and congratulated him on his success. He remembered me and said, "Sorry I wrecked your forts." He deserves all the happiness in the world.
That's a nice story. It's cool how childhood friends can leave such an impact. Jon sounds like a wild kid but clearly had a good heart. It's funny how those memories stick, like the pillow forts and all the chaos. Running into him later must have been unexpected. It's good to see that even after all those years, he still remembers those moments. People like that are worth celebrating.
My brother grew up with all the Impractical Jokers, and Sal was one of his best friends who gave a eulogy at his funeral. Sal is the exact dude you see on the show. He used to dress up as a turkey and visit my family every Thanksgiving. We called him the Turkey Man. After my brother passed, he stayed in touch with us. Even once bought me and my mom tickets to come see one of their traveling shows and got real emotional seeing my mom. He also wore a shirt for my brother in the movie. All around just a good dude. Still talk to him every now and again. He doesn't always get back to me right away, but he always eventually does and is always super concerned about how my family is doing.
That's a pretty heartfelt story. It's nice to hear how someone like Sal made an effort to stay connected after your brother passed. The little things, like dressing up as a turkey, seem to have made a real impact. It's cool that he's kept in touch and still shows that he cares. It shows a lot about his character and the bond you all shared.
Friend's mom said she went to school with Tony Hawk and was not only friends with him then, has kept in contact since then. I called bullshit until she showed me a yearbook from their high school with his signature by his pick. Years later, she sent me a video of them running into each other at an airport back east somewhere. Still kind of crazy to think he's potentially a couple phone calls away.
That's pretty wild. It's one thing to hear someone say they know a celebrity, but seeing actual proof changes things. The yearbook with the signature is solid evidence. Running into him at the airport just adds another layer. It's a reminder that 6 degrees of separation thing is real. It's like your friend has this cool connection just sitting there. It'd be interesting to see where that could lead.
Ben Stiller filmed a movie on the campus of the university where I worked. He seemed a nice guy, very serious. Since I'm old, 73, I was far less impressed by him than by his parents, who visited the set one day. I had been a Stiller and Mira fan since I was a kid, and said to me, "I'm Catholic and Jerry's Jewish, and that," pointing to Ben, "is our guilt."
That's a pretty relatable moment. Meeting someone famous often hits differently than meeting their family. It's interesting how we can be fans of a generation before, and then see the next one in a different light. The way and put it about guilt is a fun perspective on family dynamics too. Just goes to show that even in Hollywood, those connections and contrasts are pretty universal.
Cleavon Little. He was hitchhiking through our town near sunset, so the minister of our church picked him up and brought him to our house. We fed him dinner, and he entertained us kids, 6 of us, with some bedtime stories. He spent the night on the couch, and we all had breakfast together, and then he went on to Hollywood. What a nice guy.
That's a cool story. Cleavon Little sounds like he was a really down-to-earth person. It's nice when someone famous interacts with regular folks and shares their time. The bedtime stories must have been memorable for you all, especially since he was such a talented actor. It's interesting how a simple act of kindness turned into a nice experience for your family. Just goes to show, not every celebrity forgets their roots.
I grew up with Chris Stapleton. He was the most popular kid in school, but was super nice and a genuinely good guy. Went to one of his shows when he was just starting to blow up and talked to him afterwards. He was exactly the same. Seemed to be sincerely happy to see me and talked about a few old times before he had to go. Super happy to see him have so much success.
That's cool. Growing up with someone who becomes successful can be inspiring. It's nice to see that even with fame, he stayed true to himself and remembered where he came from. Those little moments, like chatting after a show, really stick with you. Feels good to see someone you know do well and be genuinely happy for them.
My dad knew Obama. His best friend was college roommates with him, and he even stayed with my grandparents in Pakistan. He's apparently an extremely humble and genuine person. My dad had great things to say about him. When in Pakistan, I heard he treated the servants/poor folks with a ton of respect as well.
That's interesting. Knowing someone who has connections to a public figure like Obama must bring a unique perspective. It's cool to hear that he treated people with respect, especially in a different country. It shows his character. It's always nice to learn about how people treat others behind the scenes.
I was in high school marching and concert band with Tony Kanal and had a college art class with Gwen Stefani. Both really nice kids. At a HS reunion, Tony was surrounded by fangirls. I was sitting at a table with some other old band friends, and he made a point to come over and chat with us for a while. And Gwen was always super sweet and kind.
That's a cool story. It's nice to hear that even after all their success, they still took the time to connect with old friends. Shows they haven't forgotten where they came from. Must have been fun to reminisce about those days in band.
I went to junior high and high school with Zero from Slipknot, aka Sid Wilson. It was right around when grunge was breaking, but we were a bit behind in Iowa. Sid was always about a year ahead of the alt trends. By the time most people were wearing something or listening to some band, he had already moved on to the next thing. I was a nerdy kid with nerdy friends, and we all got along with Sid despite not being in the same activities for the most part and not hanging out outside of school. He actually got along with pretty much anyone who wasn't a jerk. We actually did club volleyball together for a couple of years. It was new for our school at the time, and it had a mix of kids from different cliques rather than just jocks. Sid was a pretty decent player. He had a fairly high vertical for his size, but wasn't tall enough to stand out. We lost contact partway through high school, but I have nothing but fond memories of the time we spent together.
That's a cool memory. It's interesting how people can be ahead of the curve like that. Sid sounds like the kind of person who just vibes with everyone. Club volleyball mixing all those different kids must have been fun. It's nice to look back and appreciate those moments, even if life took you in different directions later on. It's all about those shared experiences, I guess.
I was friends with Jennifer Aniston before Friends. She was a very sweet/cool girl. We were hanging out in her apartment when she got the call that she was up for a character on 21 Jump Street that never came to fruition. We used to play volleyball in a racquetball court, and I've been to many dinners and parties with her and her close circle of friends. It was pretty cool seeing her years later skyrocket to stardom on Friends. I still have my personal phone book with her old number.
That's a chill memory. Knowing someone before they got famous is always interesting. Just hanging out and playing volleyball sounds like a fun time. It's cool you still have her number too. Seeing her break into the spotlight must have been a trip. Good to hear she was just a normal person back then.
Went to the same school as Luke Wilson. He dated my older sister's best friend, so I knew him his senior year in high school. Always was a nice guy, and on the random occasions I bump into him in Dallas. He's the same friendly guy I knew. He was also a really good athlete. Had the 800-meter record for our school for a long time.
That's cool. It's interesting how people can stay friendly over the years. Knowing someone like him from high school gives a different perspective. I can imagine running into him in Dallas must feel surreal sometimes. It's always nice to see that some people don't change much, especially if they were good people back then. Those athletic records are a nice touch too, adds to his story.
A family member went to high school with Prince before he was famous. He was quiet and kept to himself mostly, and was kind of nerdy, but he had a tight-knit group of buddies that he was always with. It was a fairly recently integrated neighborhood, so the black kids and the white kids were like two different worlds, so my family member didn't ever talk to him, but knew who he was and saw him all the time around the neighborhood and in the halls.
That's interesting. It's always cool to hear about people who knew someone famous before they made it big. I guess it shows how different worlds can be, especially in high school. Being quiet and nerdy seems pretty relatable. It's funny how some people just blend into the background until something changes. Sounds like your family member had a front row seat to a future superstar without even realizing it.
WWE Women's Champion, Rhea Ripley. We used to work together on independent wrestling shows when she started out. Always fun to hang out with and super chill. Ironically, she hated wearing makeup because she thought it would be selling out and not metal. Everyone knew she was going to be a massive star, even when she was still an awkward teenager. The discussion was never if WWE would sign her, it was when they would sign her.
It's cool to hear about Rhea Ripley's early days. Sounds like you had a good vibe working together. It's interesting how she had those strong views about makeup, thinking it would compromise her image. It makes sense, especially in the wrestling world where authenticity matters. You could see she had the talent and drive to make it big. Definitely a story to tell about her rise to stardom.
Not me personally, but Harrison Ford. When I was 6 or 7, I went walking around a Walmart with my grandma. She stopped at a display for whatever Indiana Jones movie had just come out and said she went to high school with him. I was like, Grandma, Indiana Jones is not a real person. LOL. She said he was a nerdy guy that got picked on, but always thought he was super sweet. I've always wondered if that was true. They're the same age, and the fact that he's from Chicago / the Chicagoland area means that she probably didn't make it up, LOL.
That's a cool story about your grandma knowing Harrison Ford. It's interesting to think about how some celebrities had pretty normal lives before they became famous. Makes you realize they were just like everyone else at some point. I always find it funny when people have these connections. Adds a personal touch to their story, even if it's a bit wild to believe at first. Seems like she could have a point.
I don't know if you can say he made it big, but Andy Daly has been in a bunch of stuff. I was in high school with him, and he was in my TV production class. We knew back then he would make it in the industry. He was funny and really talented. He was also a legend because he interviewed a Playboy playmate at the New York Playboy Club. When he arranged it, he gave the call letters of the school TV station and just left out he was only 16 and it was a high school station.
That's a cool story about Andy. It's interesting to see someone from high school achieve success in the industry. Sounds like he had some confidence back then. Sneaking in an interview like that takes some guts for sure. It's funny how those early talents can lead to something bigger later on. I wonder if he's ever looked back at those days in class.
I went to college with Grant Hill, as well as a couple of pretty legendary college basketball players that fans would still know. One day I was waiting with some other guy I didn't know in an utter downpour to try to catch a bus from one campus to the other for class. The problem is if the bus was too full, they wouldn't stop to pick you up, and that's exactly what happened. Moments later, a car pulls up. Grant Hill sticks his head out the window and says to the other guy, who he obviously knows, and tells him to get in. I'm just standing there looking for Lauren, and Grant looks at me and says, "Hey man, hurry up, come get in." So that's the story of how a member of the Basketball Hall of Fame gave me a lift to class once.
That's a cool story. You never know who might lend a hand when you're stuck. Grant Hill seems like a solid guy, not forgetting the little moments even with all his fame. It must have been nice getting that ride instead of waiting in the rain. Just goes to show that sometimes you run into people you admire when you least expect it. Makes the experience memorable, for sure.
Was in the same college class as John Mulaney. He was part of the improv troupe, and I used to go to his shows. He had a very similar shtick at 18 as he does now, sounding very corny and tight-laced, and then being shockingly crass at times. Also in our class was Ramel Ross, who was recently nominated for the Best Picture Oscar for Nickel Boys. He was on the basketball team, but never got any court time. He was quiet, nice, and very smart, and we're still friends. Actually, Britt Marling, creator of the OA, was also in our class, but I don't remember interacting with her. Actually, come to think of it, Ivanka Trump was also in our class freshman year before transferring out. She lived in the same dorm as Ramel, and I saw her often.
That's interesting. Being in a class with people like John Mulaney and Ramel Ross sounds unique. Mulaney's style must have been fun to see evolve. It's also cool that you're still friends with Ramel. It's funny how some people stand out in your memory while others fade away. Knowing Ivanka was in the same dorm adds a different layer to the mix. College can bring together some unexpected connections.
My dad went to high school with the mom on the box of the Game of Life from the 90s. Oh, And the mom that comes out of the storm shelter holding a baby at the very, very end of the original Twister is my mom's cousin. She was an extra in a bunch of early ER as well. Does that count? Edit. I can't believe I failed to mention my wife. Netflix original show Easy S2. E3 she's in the crowd at a stand-up show, about 18 minutes into the episode.
That's pretty neat. It's funny how small the world can be sometimes. Finding connections like that, especially with pop culture, makes for good conversation. Your dad's high school ties to a board game and your wife's cameo in a Netflix series really highlight those random threads that connect us to media. It gives it all a different feel when you know someone involved.
I grew up with Derrick Waters of Drunk History. He was possibly the most all-around genuinely nice dude at my school. While he definitely hung around with the cool kids and I was a first-class nerd, he was always friendly to just about everyone and one of those people that makes you feel like you've been the best of old friends every time you see them. Drunk History is hit and miss for me, but I love to see a genuinely good guy succeed.
That's cool to hear about Derrick. It's nice when someone who's well-liked sticks to their roots and treats everyone well, no matter the social scene. Even if his show isn't your favorite, it's great that you can appreciate his success and good character. It just shows that kindness stands out, and seeing someone you know do well is always something to root for.
I have too, but try not to dox myself in the process, lol. Bam Margera. He was exactly the same as on Jackass. His poor father. He was pulling the same shit before and without the cameras. Ed Helms, pretty much down to earth, loyal to his non-Hollywood friends, and supported them even in the prime of his career, hangover The Office. Just chill, regular guy in college. Hard worker.
Sounds like you had some interesting encounters. Bam seems like a wild card, just like you'd expect from his shows. It's kind of sad to hear about his dad, though. Ed Helms comes off as real laid back. It's nice to know some people stay grounded, especially when they find success. Regular guys often have the best stories. Can't help but respect that loyalty to friends.
I wouldn't say he's big to people outside of Boston, but I'm going to tell the story anyway. When my parents lived in Boston 30 years ago, one of their landlords was a guy named Tony Maserati. He was a sports journalist who treated my parents well, and my mom has fond memories of his Italian mother, who barely spoke English. These days, Tony has a sports radio show called Felger and Maz, and according to another family friend of ours, he's not well liked in Boston for his tendency to yell at the Red Sox. Thanks to the website Cameo, I was briefly able to reconnect with Tony. He immediately remembered my parents and spoke to me not as the radio guy, but the former landlord. While I don't agree with everything that happens on his radio show, I think he's cool as a person.
It's interesting how life connects people. Tony Maserati seemed like a solid landlord, even if he yells about the Red Sox now. Reconnecting through Cameo is a unique twist. It must have been nice for you to hear that personal side of him, not just the radio persona. Sometimes, it's those old connections that remind you of simpler times, even amid the noise of sports commentary. Just a reminder of where you came from, I guess.
I knew too. Christopher Mintz-Plasse, aka MC Lovin'. He was 2 grades ahead of me. His mother was my 4th grade teacher. He was pretty much that theater nerd kid. He did a lot of funny skits on our high school news network thing. Amber Lou, musician/artist. Friends since elementary, bordering on acquaintance. The last time I hung out with her was when we were in high school, at a friend's holiday party or a Manny Pacquiao fight. We were playing Rock Band.
That's interesting. I had a friend in high school who was really into performing arts too. He wasn't famous or anything, just a really funny guy. We used to act out skits for fun, and it always kept everyone entertained. Then there was this girl in our class who could sing really well. We'd sometimes jam together during lunch. Good times, nothing fancy, just a bunch of friends having fun.
I knew Chuck Garrick in high school. He is a bassist that currently plays for Alice Cooper. My older sister dated his older brother for a short time, and we lived just down the street from this family. He was a good guy in school, wasn't friends with him, but would talk to him once in a blue moon. I do remember his band in high school, playing in his garage from time to time. Don't know how he is now, or what kind of person he is. I'm just happy that he is living his dream. Hashtag.
That's a cool throwback. Knowing someone who made it in music must feel interesting. Garage bands were a big part of those years. It's nice to see that some people stick to their passions and find success. Even if you weren't close, just having those small interactions adds to the memories. It's a reminder that you never know where life will take people.
Jon Hamm was in my theater company in the late 90s. I directed him in a couple plays. He was in the first play I ever directed. He was so nice, thoughtful, charming, and everybody loved him. He's the kind of actor you want as a director. He takes direction well, makes big choices, and has good instincts, and isn't married to any choice. Genuinely does whatever will make the show better. He was a star on the stage, and we all knew he'd be a star if he ever got a shot. Plus, he was fun at parties.
It's cool that you had a chance to work with Jon Hamm back then. Sounds like he was a solid actor and a good guy to have around. Directing someone like that must have been rewarding, especially knowing he had the talent to go far. It's nice to hear he wasn't just focused on himself, but really wanted to make the whole production better. Plus, a fun party vibe always helps the team.
I waitressed in a rock and roll bar in Ithaca, New York back in the mid-80s. Lots of metal bands, mostly Megaforce, used a local studio and would come up from NJ. They'd hang at the bar afterwards. Joey and Scotty from Anthrax loved to watch hockey. Made dinner for TT Quick, I think. Had a 2-hour conversation with Kirk Hammett. Really nice guys.
Sounds like you had a pretty chill gig back in the day. Serving up food and drinks to those metal legends must have been interesting. I imagine listening to their stories and hanging out after shows made for some memorable nights. Kirk Hammett chatting for 2 hours? That's a solid way to connect. It's cool to see those big names just being regular guys at a local bar.
My mom went to HS with the late Linda Lavin. She said she was a sweetheart and was nice to everyone. I've worked with people who knew Sandra Bullock in school, and they said she was a doll. A sergeant I knew in the Marines was friends with John Stamos growing up. He told us you would never know he was famous. He was still the same cool guy he was when he was young. They would still hang out when he was home on leave.
It's interesting how some famous people stay grounded. My friend's mom used to tell stories about meeting Linda Lavin and about how nice she was. Then there's Sandra Bullock, who people say was just as friendly back in school. And the sergeant's stories about John Stamos are pretty cool too. Seems like fame doesn't change everyone, and it's nice to hear that.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.